Okay, well, everyone, want to welcome you once again. This is our final course, final class in this part one of this course right here. I want to thank you for being part of it. I also, special thanks to OLLI at University of Arkansas, Sandra, who has been our host here, but also the program director, Josh Rainey, enabling this course to go forward and for making it accessible to so many of us who are not in Arkansas to to participate in it, and for the recordings, because I know that there's a lot of information to cover, and sometimes you can't be here. Sometimes you want to review it or just view it. And Arkansas, under Sandra's guidance right there, has really made that very accessible. So I want to acknowledge that. Okay. Um, what I want to begin with today is just a little summary of where we've been and how it pertains to today. So in our first episode, we looked at the military spying on the White House. And when it was discovered, we concluded by looking at how the president responded to it. His decision was, we need to bury this, cover it up. And that will be pertinent to today. In our second episode, I revealed how the CIA had infiltrated the White House through the persons of E. Howard Hunt and James McCord Jr. Last week, we got into exploring more about John Dean and his interest in what is going on at the Democratic National Headquarters. We also looked at how a call girl operation had been set up nearby and how James McCord, through one of his associates, had placed transmitters in that operation over there, both in room transmitters and phone transmitters, and how all of that dialogue occurring in there was being captured and recorded on tape by his associate Lou Russell, and this was then turned over to the CIA for their purposes. But once John Dean became interested, then the focus has really turned for McCord to try and subvert that activity, which we saw in the May entry or entries into the Democratic National Headquarters. And it was all an attempt to make it not successful, because they didn't want this John Dean and his interest from the White House messing up this good situation that the CIA had going on with Kathy Ricken and Joe Nesline over at the call girl operation. All of this is, these three separate storylines, if you will, are going to converge today in episode 4. And so let's get into that. Well, let me share my screen here. Yeah. And as noted, when I hope that each of you are able to join us in part 2, which will take place in the fall, in which this thesis that I put forward, how there is a silent coup occurring against Richard Nixon, really plays out. But we're in part 1, and I'm setting up much of the foundation for this story. And today, episode 4, Sex Sells. Does it ever? We will look at the famous break-in almost exclusively today, what I call the bungled break-in, or my subhead here, or maybe it went almost as planned. So we're looking at the second and what would be the final break-in, the one which most Americans refer to as the beginning of the case. But what I've shown you over the previous episodes, the case really or the story really begins much earlier, 2 years earlier, in fact. But what we're going to experience today is the event that will result in many people going to prison and in the resignation of President Nixon. 8 men were involved in the execution, supervision, and observation of the break-in on that night of June 16 going into 17. Liddy, Hunt, McCord, Baldwin, Barker, Sturgis, Martinez, and Virgilio Gonzalez. Now, there is actually a 9th man, but I'm going to leave him off except to mention him, and that is Lou Russell. Lou is the associate that McCord has hired to be monitoring all the conversations occurring at the Columbia Plaza call girl operation. I'll deal with him at the end. This is a good image to show us what we're really looking at again, so we can have a picture in our minds of what we're talking about. The Watergate complex is essentially a residential facility made up of condominiums, as you see there. And there's also a hotel. And Liddy is in room, along with Hunt, in room 214 of the hotel. And in the room on the floor directly above him, the Cuban CIA assets are staying. They are in room 314. But the command post for our purposes is room 214. And everybody is gathering there at 8 p.m. on Friday, June 16th. Also for our purposes here, I want to point out the former Howard Johnson's. It's directly across from the Watergate complex there, the office complex. When Liddy arrived at room 214, he found lights, camera stands, men practicing rapid fire photography because they were intending to shoot many photos while they're in the DNC. Now, this image that I've put up here is what occurred in the days afterward. These are police investigators that are crowding into room 214. But I use it because it gives us a sense of what Liddy experienced when he walks into the room, and both McCord and the other CIA operatives are in there. It's a crowded 214. Because of the rush, that is the need to change out the bug, at least as Liddy thought, but as we discovered last week, the bug has already been removed from that telephone in Spencer Oliver's office. And now we also have the recent Magruder insistence that the team go in and photograph everything. And he's telling them one should go and photograph everything that's in Larry O'Brien's office. But as we know, and we'll see, that's not where they're going. When Liddy arrived in 214 that night, he couldn't believe how sloppy their bugging operations were. But he was not the technical expert on this. That was James McCord. And he left that responsibility to him and to the other ex-CIA men who were on the job here. It was a Friday night, and the expectation was that the DNC would be vacant. Everybody's cleared out for the weekend, but guess what? The lights stayed on and on and on. And here's what's going on. A young male volunteer from the West Coast was staying late to take advantage of the free long-distance phone line to talk to his girlfriend in California. Isn't that always the case? Because you remember how expensive long-distance phone calls were at that time. He wasn't getting paid, so hey, I'm going to get something out of this. Liddy decided to delay the break-in from a scheduled 10 p.m. entry to midnight because this guy just kept staying on. Using the pretext of delivering a typewriter, however, McCord got himself into the building at 10:50 p.m. So this also raises the question, what's McCord doing? It's hard for McCord to sit still. So he said, I'm going to go over and see if I can get in there, and I'll use the pretext of delivering a typewriter to get past the guard. And he did so. He takes an elevator up to the 8th floor because he announces, I'm going to the Federal Reserve Board, which occupies the entire 8th floor. DNC is on the 6th floor. But what's curious is the Federal Reserve offices had recently been burglarized. So it's interesting that they allowed him to just get entry to take this typewriter up there. He went through the stairwell. After he got up to the 8th floor, he then came down through the stairwell. And as he did so, he went all the way down to the garage, but he was taping doors and stuffing latches, door latches, with bits of paper on the 8th and the 6th floors, and also B2 and B3 levels, and the doors leading into the underground garage from the street. So McCord seemingly is taking care of some early business, but maybe not. He returned to the command post, that's room 214 in the Watergate Hotel, and then he immediately left to go over to his employee, his associate, Alfred Baldwin, and his observation post in the Howard Johnson Hotel. And all of this activity is occurring before 11:50. McCord is being a busy fellow. At the Watergate office building, GSS security guard Frank Wills, shown here in the photograph, they had a subcontracted out their security service to GSS. He arrived for work, he logged in, and he began his scheduled midnight inspection of the facility. And almost just as soon as he began, he discovered the tampered locks on B2 and B3. And like a good employee, he immediately went back to the lobby and wrote down in his logbook that they had been stuffed with paper. And that's the image you see in to the right here. You see a photograph of Frank Wills and his actual logbook that he kept there. Although the stuffing could have been a maintenance man's doing, Wills decided, maybe I better call my boss, my superior. And he did so, but he couldn't reach his superior immediately, however. He left a message saying there was a problem and I want you to call back and give me instructions. What a good guy. I mean, this guy is following protocol and procedures for his business. As he's waiting for a callback, he called another superior who told him to go ahead and check the locks on the other doors. And now, as he is preparing to leave to do this, Bruce Givner, the late-staying campaign volunteer, came out of the elevator into the lobby from the DNC, and he said, hey, I'm going to get something to eat. And Will said, okay, I'll go across the street with you. And the two of them crossed Virginia Avenue to go to the Howard Johnsons to get something to eat. Now, Givner is going to stay and eat his meal there, but Frank Wills is going to get his order to go. So he'll get his order, put his order in, it'll be prepared within 10 minutes, and he's walking right back across Virginia Avenue to the lobby. During that period of time, however, the DNC was now dark, and so was the office building's lobby. And McCord could see this from where he is at. And he reached Hunt and Liddy by walkie-talkie, and he told them, it's not clear yet. So the break-in was further delayed. So instead of going in at midnight, they pushed it back again. The reason McCord lied to Liddy, he's been deceiving him all along, and delaying the break-in was because he's waiting for his associate, Lou Russell, to arrive. Now, nobody knows about Lou except James McCord. Well, during this delay, Wills, with his prepared meal in a sack lunch, returns to his guard post, and he receives the message from the other superior to go ahead and check the locks. So that's what he sets out to do. Liddy, at the command post in the hotel, was dependent on information from McCord, who, as we've noted here, is not sitting tight, because every few minutes, McCord seemed to be somewhere else. Presumably, he's on the lookout for Lou Russell. It's now 1:05 a.m. We're now into June 17th, and McCord arrives at room 214, claiming that he'd been checking the doors and locks. But if he had actually done this, he would have discovered that Wills had cleared them earlier on his first pass through the basement, B2 and B3. Regardless, the burglars set out, and Hunt and Liddy remain behind in room 214, connected to the McCord group and Alfred Baldwin by walkie-talkie. 5 minutes later, the burglars arrived at the B2 door of the Watergate and discovered that it was relocked and they could not get inside. After finding the way blocked, McCord, Barker, and Martinez went back to the command post, that is room 14, to confer with Liddy and Hunt, but Gonzalez and Sturgis stayed back. Gonzalez was the locksmith. He tried to pick the lock, and Sturgis was his lookout. With McCord now giving his report, Hunt objected to going forward with the operation that night. Hunt does not know this secret game that McCord is playing, but his instincts are telling him this is going south, and we need to put a stop to it. Oop. Did I lose you all? I think let me go back. I got to get back and share my screen here.
Yeah, John, your PowerPoint went away, so
okay,
is
we'll get
everything
back
okay?
on. Everything's fine. I'm just gonna it just bounced away there for a moment, and so we'll get back. There we are.
All right.
We're good. Well, as I just noted there, Liddy overruled the concern that was being expressed by Howard Hunt, and he told the team to go back and proceed. And a lot of this had to do with money. First of all, he didn't want to be there on this operation. He was doing it at the order of Magruder, not knowing the order was really coming from John Dean. But we'll go in and we'll photograph these paper, whatever you want, in Larry O'Brien's, and we're going to change out the bugs. From Liddy's point of view, he figured, listen, a maintenance man may have removed the lock stuffing, at no alarm has been raised, so we're still good. Let's go. Once the burglars left the Watergate Hotel, they were carrying incriminating items. Among them were false IDs, a key to room 214, $100 bills that had been laundered by Bernard Barker, and an address book with Hunt's name in it. And here we can see the police photograph of what had been taken from them that night. And in the upper right-hand corner of this image here, you see that plastic bag filled with rolls of film. They walked in there, or attempted to walk in there, with 35 to 40 rolls of film. And as I note, for the burglars to be carrying this stuff in their pockets it was careless, but it seems to me it borders on intention. As I noted, Liddy thought the target was Larry O'Brien's desk, but Hunt, however, had given instructions to the Cuban members of the team to target the Spencer Oliver, Maxie Wells area of the DNC. During the break-in, check this out. Once again, McCord splits away from the group. Presumably, Lou Russell had arrived at the scene and McCord needed to provide entry for him in the building. It's now 1:30 on the 17th. Gonzalez has been successful in opening and retaping the door, and the burglars were able to enter from the garage to the office building, and they went in and up the stairs. They weren't using the elevator, they used the adjacent staircase. From somewhere, McCord suddenly reappeared and joined the team in the stairwell, and the five men walked up to the 6th floor. What's so interesting to me is that nobody is questioning McCord. Where'd you go? Why'd you go away? What's happening here, Jim? Huh? The burglars were trying to get into the DNC office when, back down below, Wills discovered that the B2 lock had been retaped. The guard returned to the lobby, made phone calls to his two colleagues again to inform them of the situation. Following his supervisor's instruction, Wills telephoned the District of Columbia Police. As I noted, there had been a burglary a couple weeks before on the 8th floor. They weren't going to mess around. Get the DC police in here. So the call went out from the dispatcher. Now, just a little side note here. There was an officer, a uniformed officer in a marked vehicle just a short distance away, but he was about to go off duty and he begged off. Oh, come on, I'm doing paperwork and I'm about to go off duty. Get somebody else do it. And the call was picked up by an undercover team who was just a short distance away. And they said, wait, we'll take it. They had no hesitation. Meanwhile, McCord, Martinez, Baker, Sturgis, and Gonzalez had some difficulty getting through the main door. What had happened was, I can't explain this, but there had developed some corrosion on the lock and it wasn't opening easily for Gonzalez. So what they ended up doing was pulling the hinges off the door, because apparently the hinges were external, not internal to the office. They pulled the hinges and lifted the door off its hinges in order to access the space. So that was eating into their time already. And following Hunt's orders, they were not in Larry O'Brien's office. And once again, you can see here, O'Brien's office is in the lower right-hand corner of this diagram. And if you look in the lower center, you will see where the elevator lobby is at, and adjacent to it is the stairwell. And just ahead of where it says elevator lobby is the main doorway, which they're having so much trouble with. They had to pull the hinges and lift the door off. When they go through, they go directly ahead toward the Virginia Avenue glass wall, as that is where the goods are at. They're going to Spencer Oliver's office and the adjacent office of Maxie Wells. They're never going to Larry O'Brien's office, even though Liddy thinks that's what the story is. At that moment, the undercover police officers roll up to the Watergate office building, as noted, in an unmarked car. After some chatter, back to make sure I got the right thing here. Okay, no, here we go. I'm back on track. So the undercover officers roll up in their unmarked car. Meanwhile, in Spencer Oliver's office, Martinez begins setting up a camera on Maxie Wells's desk. And as I said, they have many rolls of 35 millimeter film because they're preparing to take photos of photos. They're taking photos of the naked call girls that are in Maxie Wells's file cabinet. That's what they're there for. John Dean has sent this team via Magruder with that instruction. After some chatter in the lobby, Wills and the undercover police officers went up the stairwell to the 8th floor, the location of the Federal Reserve that had recently been burglarized. They're going to start there and work their ways down. And this is a photograph of the two DC police officers as they appeared on their undercover detail. They were doing vice and drugs that night. Inside the DNC, Martinez heard the noise from the police trampling about upstairs, and McCord told him it was probably the regular 2 o'clock inspection round, and he advised Barker to turn off his walkie-talkie. In doing so, they are going to cut themselves off from communication with Hunt and Liddy, as well as Alfred Baldwin in the lookout position in the Howard Johnsons. Finding no one on the 8th floor, the police began working their ways down the floors below. Now, from his observation post in the Howard Johnsons, Alfred Baldwin, who'd been watching TV all night, late night TV, and it's just hilarious. This is what he was watching: Attack of the Puppet People. And it ended. And only when it ended did he look up and out through his window, and what he saw was an actual horror story taking place across the street of Virginia Avenue. And over his walkie-talkie, he asked Liddy in room 214, "Hey, any of our guys wearing hippie clothes?" "Negative," Liddy replied. "All of our people in business suits." "Why?" Baldwin told him, "We got trouble then, because there are men with guns on the 6th floor. Inside the DNC, the burglars soon deduced that the jig was up. "They got us," Barker whispered over the walkie-talkie. They knew when these guys entered, they tried to hide, but there was nowhere to hide, really. With guns drawn, the police entered the DNC offices, and they were surprised to discover the men whom they did. They found them hiding behind desks, and they ordered them to stand up and assume the position. And they noticed from their clothing, because they were wearing business suit, they weren't wearing suits, they were wearing coats and ties. And this isn't what they usually encountered on a burglary in Washington. And the burglars complied. Now, while under arrest, with his hands up against the wall, Martinez attempted a calculated risk. He reached inside his coat pocket for something, and one of the officers saw this, and he immediately slammed him hard against the wall. Thought he was reaching for a weapon. The officer searched Martinez thoroughly to see what he'd been trying to get rid of, and look what it was: a small key taped to the back of a notebook. This police evidence that I revealed to you last week. It's a key to Maxie Wells's desk given to him by Howard Hunt. It was a key to the desk filled with the call girl photos. In the Watergate hotel, Hunt knew that it was all over, and he told Liddy that they'd have to get out quickly because Barker had a key to the room. Foolishly, that he had allowed him to take it. And this photograph now focuses on the key 3 buildings that we're looking at: the hotel, the DNC on room floor 6 of the Watergate office complex, and directly across the street where Alfred Baldwin is at, observing what's going down. That is, Hunt and Liddy exited so rapidly they didn't take time to clean the room. And this is one action that really surprises me, that that Hunt panicked so much that they would just literally walk out of the room without taking all the elements that they had in there with them, evidence. And the evidence that they left behind is this: electronic equipment, $100 bills that match sequentially to those that are in the burglar's pockets. All of this should have been gathered up. There was no rush. But Hunt, these experts in intelligence, panicked, and they fled the room, leaving so much behind. As Hunt and Liddy left the hotel, they saw McCord and the other burglars being led out of the building into a paddy wagon. They also noticed, after the police walked out, a sixth man just quietly and undisturbed walked out of the lobby. That was McCord's other associate, Lou Russell. He hadn't been picked up in the bust. Anyway, Hunt wanted Baldwin to load up the equipment from the Howard Johnsons into McCord's van and get away, which he did. But Baldwin took everything away in the van, including the walkie-talkie, and he ended up driving all of this evidence to McCord's home in the Maryland suburb. So once again, instead of ditching this stuff, he connected it to one of the people who had been arrested. Liddy, he arrives home at 3 a.m., thinking of all the evidence that he would soon have to destroy, and his wife, when he's crawling into bed, still in his clothes, "Honey, is anything wrong?" "There was some trouble, and people got caught. I'll probably be going to jail." That's Gordon. That's really straightforward, very Joe Friday, huh? "I'll probably be going to jail." Well, in the investigation that followed, it will be determined that the key found on Martinez was to Wells's desk, Maxie Wells's desk, although Wells and her assistant each had their own copy. So somehow, you'll remember from last week that Baldwin did his walk around the office, presumably picked up a key, but managed to get, after making a copy, get that key returned so it was never observed. Subsequently, investigators will never ask Maxie Wells what was in her desk that was deemed to be so important to the burglars. However, an assistant counsel for the minority staff on the Senate committee, that's one of the Republican investigators, he noted that the information in Wells's desk could have significantly altered the focus of the investigation if they ever acknowledged it. But this is what they don't want to do, is to focus on what they were really looking for. Okay, we're going to change here just for a little bit, and now we're going to look at what we really consider to be a major element in the Watergate story, which is the cover-up. Or as I like to note here, it is the beginning of the big fat lie. On June 17th, well, let me stop for a second. This is a good point just to ask. Are there any questions that anyone has before I take this journey? Go ahead, Kathy. Go ahead.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I have a question. I thought the CIA had taken the photographs, right?
Which photographs are you referring to?
Of the call girls.
No, all those are all, private. There's two sets of photographs. One set of photographs are those privately taken by the attorney, Philip Macon Bailey. Those have been in his file cabinet, and those were picked up by the district attorney or the federal attorney to make the case against him. Those are off the table at the world.
Who
What-
was taking the photos across the street? Wasn't
Okay,
that?
those photographs are, if you will, I'll call them professional photos. Those are photos that Erica Riken had taken for the girls who are working for her, and she has placed in various locations around the city so that when a man comes in and says, you know, I'm interested, they can just go through those files and say, oh, I like this girl here, and then a phone conversation would be set up. Those photos, you know, really are at the control of Erica Riken. The
Okay.
CIA under James McCord, they're not taking any photographs. They're recording all of the
Okay,
conversation.
there, all right, all
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
that-
yeah.
That was my, okay.
That's fine. Anything else?
Let's go, Federal Reserve.
So there we have it. So what, again, just to summarize it briefly, Liddy thinks these guys are going in there to photograph what's in Larry O'Brien's desk, but Hunt knows that these guys are really going in there to photograph all the photographs of the women in Maxie Wells's desk to take that information back to Dean, for Dean to go through. Because he wants to see, you know, how Mo Biner, AKA Clout, is doing. On June 17th, the morning of the break-in, after these guys have been arrested and taken into the DC police headquarters, Jeb Magruder is in Los Angeles. He's traveling with John Mitchell, Fred LaRue, and Robert Mardian, political coordinator of the Committee to Re-elect the President. This is the committee, this is the main team for the Committee to Re-elect. John Mitchell, Jeb Magruder, and Robert Mardian. Political meetings had been scheduled for that day, and a Bel Air party was planned with entertainment and industry celebrities for the coming evening. They're there to, you know, make a big haul on money. In Washington, Liddy arrived at his office at the Committee to Re-elect and begins shredding documents related to the break-in. He probably got maybe an hour or two of sleep, and he's back on the job again, shredding. When it was appropriate to place a call to the West Coast, Liddy contacted Magruder and told him of the arrests. Reportedly, they've been apprehended in the act of trying to bug the opposition's headquarters, but that had never happened. And Magruder asked, well, what the hell was McCord doing in the water? You were supposed to keep him out of this operation and keep us separated from it. And because McCord ostensibly is security for the Committee to Re-elect, he shouldn't be on this team. But Liddy put the blame on funding. He said, you wanted me to go back in. I needed someone to do the installation or the change out on this bug, and McCord's the only one who can do it. In this phone call, he's trying to also stress to Magruder that it's imperative to inform Mitchell, because Mitchell may be asked about it at a scheduled press conference later that morning. He's trying to get Jeb Magruder to focus. But rather than contacting Mitchell, as Liddy is insisting, one of Magruder's first actions is to get a hold of John Dean. This call to Dean is the real trigger for the Watergate cover-up. In their conversation, Dean puts forward the idea that John Mitchell should contact the now Attorney General Richard Kleindienst and have him immediately release James McCord from custody. They can leave those other guys in jail, but they got to get McCord out. But in fact, Mitchell never gave this direction. He hadn't even been informed of the break-in when this alleged order from him was issued. When news of the break-in did reach Mitchell, it was at about 10 a.m. in Beverly Hills, so that's 1 p.m. in DC time. And his response is, "This is incredible." While Magruder would give testimony that Mitchell began giving orders, trying to manage the crisis, this testimony was false. And only much later would Magruder admit the truth about what he did that day. Allegedly, Mitchell ordered Mardian to locate Kleindienst and to have him get McCord released from custody, because with McCord gone, the connection to the White House would be severed. Prior to Magruder informing Mitchell, however, he called Liddy. And he informed Liddy that Mitchell wants you to intercede with Kleindienst. Well, Liddy had his head on straight and he said that was a terrible idea. We shouldn't be dragging in the Attorney General. But Magruder pushed forward and told him the exact words you got to use. Tell him John sent you, as in John Mitchell sent you. So Liddy, good soldier that he is, he went off and he approached Kleindienst at the Burning Tree Country Club, where he was playing a round of golf at about noon that day. Now, Kleindienst knew that Mitchell would never send someone such as Liddy to make a request such as this, and he just out and out refused. So, where had the direction come from? Well, as we noted, it's coming from John Dean. And earlier, John Dean had been in the Philippine Islands attending an event in Manila. And Manila is 12 hours ahead of Washington and 15 hours ahead of Beverly Hills. Late on his last evening there, Dean got this phone call from California. It's the phone call from Magruder informing him of the break-in. And the call came soon after Magruder learned of it from Liddy. So we can just see the trail right there. Liddy calls Magruder, and Magruder calls Dean. In the call, Magruder and Dean came up with the idea of sending Liddy to talk with Kleindienst and of using Mitchell's name to spur action. As drawn from the late admission from Magruder, because Magruder was lying when he was first arrested, but much later, Magruder would tell the truth, and he will admit that Dean is the originator of the cover-up. Dean is the source of the big fat lie. Dean will testify that he did not learn of the break-in until having arrived back in the US, but that is not true. Dean learned of it while he was still in Manila. He will later claim, well, I didn't learn about it until my plane landed in San Francisco. And instead of hanging out in San Francisco, I figured I better get back to DC. But that's a big fat lie. This is where we begin the next element of the story that many people are aware of, which has to do with the payoff. As I like to say, money changes everything. Nixon was vacationing in Florida at the time of the break-in. Haldeman learned of it on Saturday, June 17th. And his response, wiretap the Democratic National Committee? For what? It's ludicrous. They got nothing over there. I mean, sensible people had their heads on that day. Haldeman tried, but was not able to contact Magruder until the following day, June 18th. And I think Magruder is hiding out from his boss. Because look at that photograph of Haldeman up there. He looks like a CIA agent who rolls in to do the wet work. He's fearsome. And Magruder's hiding out. Later, though, from Magruder, he will learn that the break-in had been sponsored but not ordered by the CRP, the Committee to Re-elect. So Magruder is trying to mollify the situation here. Magruder stated that the burglars had been acting on their own and just got carried away. And with these statements, Magruder, again, is telling his own big fat lie, because you'll remember, Magruder's the one who, through Dean, is the one who ordered them to go back in and get all that stuff out of Larry O'Brien's drawer. Magruder mentioned the name of the runaway operative, James McCord, and said that he worked for Gordon Liddy. Haldeman had no idea who McCord was, but he had heard of Liddy, but had never met him. To him, it all seemed very remote from the White House, and for that, Haldeman was very relieved. He was given a little honeymoon here before it all broke loose. In Washington, Ehrlichman learned from the Secret Service that the DC police had found on the burglars a check signed by Howard Hunt and a White House phone number associated with him. Ehrlichman remembered Hunt as being an employee of Chuck Colson, so he immediately contacts Colson. And Colson is surprised to learn of the break-in and asked about Hunt. Colson claimed that Hunt had been off the White House payroll for the past 2 months. He's been working over for the committee to re-elect. Again, they had a momentary sense of relief. Haldeman and Ehrlichman, connected by phone later that Sunday, conferred about Hunt's non-involvement. And so they're all relieved these guys that have been picked up have nothing to do with the White House. It now is Monday morning. So these guys find out about it on Saturday and they're conferring about it on Sunday, and they think what's got nothing to do with us. Monday morning, June 19th, everything begins to change. Dean, the one who sent them on this break-in, meets Liddy in his office at the Executive Office Building. And Liddy was pleased to see the White House counsel. And as Liddy said, now I'll be getting some decisions and assistance in getting our men out on bail. Dean suggested, Gordon, why don't we go for a walk? And they went out the side door of the EOB. Dean did not want to be seen in the company of Gordon Liddy. They take a walk and they arrive at a park not far from the Corcoran Art Gallery. Those of you who know DC know this is all close proximity. As they talked, Liddy wanted to know whether Dean would be his damage control officer, because if so, he would tell Dean everything. Dean agreed that he was that man, and Liddy proceeded to lay it all on the line. Dean interrupted at one point to ask a crucial question. Was anybody in the White House connected to the break-in? Gordon Strachan, said Liddy, that's all. Liddy thought that in telling this to Dean, he was in effect telling it to the president, whom he very much wanted to protect. He had no sense that Dean was operating on his own, or else he wouldn't have been so forthcoming. Liddy's complete trust in Dean as the messenger was evident in what he said next in the conversation: a plea for assistance for the arrested burglars. He wanted them out of jail. He wanted financial support for them in the period before the trial. He also informed Dean that some of them had been involved in the break-in a year earlier at the office of Ellsberg's Beverly Hills psychiatrist, Dr. Leslie Fielding. They won't talk, but they were promised that kind of support. Well, according to Liddy, Dean promised bail attorney's fees, and support for the burglars' families. Dean made these promises on his own without ever having talked to a single senior member of the administration, not Mitchell, not Ehrlichman, not Haldeman. Liddy then told Dean that there would be an FBI investigation and that Dean should try to make an effort to obtain the raw data, that is the FD 302s and the Airtels. These would enable Dean to know what information was coming into FBI headquarters and who was likely to be interviewed. Dean asked about Hunt and Liddy, Dean asked about Hunt, and Liddy said that he was lying low trying to dodge reporters. Dean responded that it would be a good idea for him to take a powder, perhaps join his wife and children in Europe. Today, if possible, get out of town. As they finished up their walk in the park, Dean told Liddy, I don't think it's a good idea for me to be talking with you anymore. So Liddy asked, well, who's going to be my new damage control officer? And Dean told him that person would come and identify themselves to you. And with that, Liddy saluted and left. Now, it's crucial to recount this walk in the park conversation because it implicates Dean, as it should, and it exculpates Ehrlichman. Because in the future, Dean is going to lay all of this off on John Ehrlichman. Following this meeting with Liddy, Dean met at noon with Ehrlichman and Colson. Dean told them of his advice that Hunt should take a powder, and these two guys said, that's a terrible idea, and put a stop to that now. The men then discussed Hunt's relationship vis-a-vis the White House. Although he was no longer employed, he still had an office, albeit a small closet-like office, and in there he had a safe, and there were contents that he had in there. In fact, on that very morning, Hunt had been in there tidying up his office, but he didn't remove anything from the safe. And here's where we're going to get into Hunt's safe. But before I do that, let me ask, any questions at this point that you have on your minds?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
About, who is this Larry, that we originally, and why is it that they were trying to get into, or why did the burglars think it was important to get into this office?
So, Delana, what you're asking, why were they trying to get into the DNC?
No.
Okay.
Was Larry connected to the DNC?
Was who connected to the DNC?
Larry, because remember.
Oh, Larry O'Brien?
O'Brien, yes.
Yes, Larry O'Brien is the chairman of the DNC.
Okay.
But he's never there. He's got an office, but he's never there. He's in Miami. And that's what, from the outset, Gordon Liddy is saying, why are we in there? There's nothing going on there. We need to be down in Miami. You paid me $250,000, to carry out this reduced gemstone program, but the target is Miami. But he is shifted off of that by Magruder, who is operating off of Dean's insistence that they get into the DNC, because Dean wants to get into Spencer Oliver and Maxie Wells's office because they have information on his girlfriend. So that's okay. Anybody else? All right, let's get into Hunt's safe, because this is a big storehouse of evidence here. After that afternoon meeting, Ehrlichman directed Dean to open Hunt's safe and inventory its content. Unfortunately for Dean, he is putting the fox in charge of the hen house. Having moved Hunt's safe to a storage room, Dean and several other administration officials were present when technicians drilled the lock and opened its door. In the safe were several kinds of explosives. I mean, hey, what kind of CIA guy would he be if he didn't have explosives in there. He had powder caps, he had dynamites and plastique. He also had an automatic revolver, and he had McCord's attaché case. The McCord's attachés contained tear gas canisters and electronic gear, a psychological profile of Ellsberg prepared by the CIA, classified material on the Pentagon Papers, a folder on Hunt's investigation of Ted Kennedy following Chappaquiddick, and fabricated State Department cables created by Hunt to link JFK to the assassination of President Diem. Also, a pop-up address book, and as I mentioned last week, 2 black notebooks made by Hermé. All of this evidence was turned over to the person who had sent the men into the DNC, John Dean. By evening of June 19th, confusion is now reigning in the White House and the CRP about the burglary and the arrested men. Dean and Magruder had set up these events and the cover-up events in motion, but only they knew about them, and the 2 of these guys are just lying to save their ass at this moment. Neither the White House nor the committee to re-elect was interested in dealing with the other. Both were content to leave matters to the one man who seemed to easily talk to both sides, Mr. Pleasant here, John Dean. Dean knew precisely what was going on, and no one else had a clue. Tuesday, June 20th, an article by Bob Woodward, even though what I'm showing here is from the day later, has Carl Bernstein's byline on it, appeared in the Washington Post, and this article stuns President Nixon. It was information that, in it was information that Howard Hunt's name appeared in the burglar's address book. One of Hunt's signed checks had been found on the person of the Cubans, and that Hunt had been a consultant to Chuck Colson. Moreover, the Democratic Party had already filed a $1 million civil suit against this committee to re-elect for invasion of privacy and violation of civil rights. And what you see here is the address book. And on the right-hand side, you'll see on the second entry down where it says name HH, and that's for Howard Hunt, and below it says WH, that's for the White House. That's how they knew the connection of Howard Hunt and the White House were involved with this activity. At a 10 a.m. meeting, this is on the 20th, in Ehrlichman's office, and attended by all the heavyweights, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, Kleindienst, and Dean, the first subject was leaks. How did this information get out there about Hunt and McCord? Kleindienst, now serving as Attorney General, assured the men that it had not come from the Department of Justice, but from the Metropolitan Police Department. Mitchell stated, I don't know anything about that foolishness over at the DNC. I do know I didn't approve the stupid thing. Dean left the meeting in the company of Kleindienst. Attorney General was furious about the break-in and about Liddy's approach to him on the golf course at Burning Tree. But of course, Dean said nothing about his role in those events. And when they reached the Justice Building, they were joined by Assistant Attorney General in charge of Criminal Division, Henry Peterson, a real straight shooter here, but boy, is he going to go off the path shortly. Dean asked Peterson, following Liddy's guidance, for the 302s, the investigative reports prepared by the field agents. Dean, once again, invoked Nixon's name to get to them. I'm serving on behalf of the president. Kleindienst and Peterson quite properly refused to give up the 302s, which were raw data, and said they would supply only summaries of the data. The Attorney General added that if the president wanted to see the reports, he would take them to Nixon himself. Dean had promised Kleindienst and Peterson that when he returned to the White House, he would directly brief the president about Watergate, but he did not do that. He had no intention of doing this. He's trying to manage his own problem here. Instead, he had a more personally important task to accomplish, namely to examine the contents that he just finished pulling out of Hunt's safe. Dean reviewed these items with his subordinate, White House counsel Fred Fielding, and Dean told Fielding to segregate the most politically sensitive papers while he placed McCord's briefcase in a locked closet in his office, and he hid Hunt's personal papers in his safe. The remaining Hunt materials, which were negligible, were left in cartons on the office floor of the office, and we'll give those to the FBI when they eventually show up. So he's already taken out the most damaging things to himself. The items that Dean placed in his safe were Hunt's 2 Air Maine notebooks and the pop-up address book. He would later testify that these notebooks contained Hunt would later testify that these notebooks contained what he knew about Gemstone, and that they contained specific references to Dean's own role as one of Liddy's principals. And Dean did not want that out. So now we're on Wednesday, June 21st. Dean turned his full attention to the FBI investigation, and that meant focusing on L. Patrick Gray, acting director of FBI. Approximately 1 month earlier, the long-standing director of FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, died suddenly. Rather than replace that position with a high-ranking member of FBI, such as Mark Felt, and we'll deal with that extensively in part 2, Nixon appointed an outsider. In the first several meetings that the two men would have during the next few days, Gray passed to Dean some new information that FBI had uncovered, but he still did not understand, and this dealt with the money. Through Gray, Dean sat in on all FBI interviews of White House employees. As Gray would later say, Dean informed me he would be reporting directly to the president. So Dean has, inappropriately infiltrated himself into the investigation that eventually is going to find him, but he's doing everything he can to deflect it. In fact, Dean had no intention of carrying the information to the president. He was controlling the White House investigation while influencing and being influenced by the FBI investigation. With the crime now 6 days old, the FBI was beginning to develop some theories about it, because all the signs seemed to point to CIA. On learning this, Gray called the agency director, Richard Helms, shown here on the left and Gray on the right. Helms said he was sure there was no CIA involvement. On the evening of June 21st, Gray met with Dean and discussed the early theories of CIA involvement, however, and Gray told Dean that the FBI was going to pursue all leads aggressively unless we were told by CIA that there was a CIA interest in the case. And with this, Dean saw a way to kill the official investigation. If the FBI could be convinced that its agents had indeed stumbled on a CIA operation and told to go no further, it was likely the problem could be contained and restricted to the 5 men already arrested. Hunt would not be dragged in, and maybe not even Liddy. That meant that even Dean himself could not be touched. It was an exciting idea for Dean, and he tried to figure out how he could set it in motion. He couldn't accomplish the task by himself. He would need help from much higher up, and he planned on getting it in the morning. And here now introduces the smoking gun in my gag here. No, not Alec Baldwin's smoking gun. But let me ask any questions we have here. Margaret, go ahead.
I remember at that time when it first happened that all the news outlets were reporting that it was, I believe, 5 Cubans who had infiltrated the DNC. That was what they were talking about on the news. It wasn't until much later that, anything else other than it was the Cubans were retaliating kind of thing.
Right. And what do you think about that today?
Probably true.
Well, the Cubans are there because they are CIA assets. They had participated in Operation Zapata. They were close to E. Howard Hunt. He's the one who recruited them. So we've got these there's actually 4 CIA assets, the 4 Cubans. And then we have 2 CIA operatives, Hunt and McCord. Even though both of them ostensibly had retired, they're still both working for CIA at this time. Mm-hmm. So this is a CIA operation, and it went south, as in what I think. Well, I have to be careful I don't get too deeply into this. McCord was setting this thing up so that it would go south, so it would put a stop to John Dean's interest in this call girl surveillance they had going on. He was supposed to get away, but he didn't get away. That's why his friend Lou Russell was there that night to provide diversion, so McCord could get out of the building before if anything happened. And McCord got wrapped up in it. Okay, Kathy,
I have one more question, and it's why did McCord want this to go south? Why was he
adamant to make it?
Because Dean's interest in the call girl operation is endangering the CIA's surveillance of that operation. The CIA is getting too much good stuff by surveilling the phone calls and what's going on in the bedrooms over at Columbia Plaza. And Dean has inserted himself into the situation by setting this White House team, or a committee to re-elect team, into plant a bug that wasn't getting anything at all, and then to photograph the photographs of the girls. And he's got to shut down Dean's interest in this so that they can keep moving forward.
okay? All right.
Okay. Here comes the smoking gun. In a previously accepted version of Watergate history, June 23rd is the day on which the event occurred that would eventually sink the Nixon presidency, an event chronicled on the White House tape known as the smoking gun. The tape was concealed by the White House for some time after many other taped conversations in the Oval Office and Nixon's EOB office had been released in written form to Congress and the press. It was only forced out by a decision of the Supreme Court in the summer of '74, and shortly after it became public knowledge, Nixon resigned. This is what we will cover in part 2. I'll go into this in much greater detail. The reason for the long concealment is obvious. On the tape, the president is heard directing obstruction of justice by instructing Haldeman to have CIA impede FBI's investigation into the Watergate burglary. Since the tape contained a discussion of the problem, the acknowledgement that there's no reason to deter the investigation other than political expediency, and the issuance of the order, the tape is direct evidence of criminal guilt. What has not been understood is that the Nixon remarks are the products of John Dean's deception that tricked Haldeman and Nixon into a joint conspiracy to obstruct justice. By June 22nd, Dean had already constructed his big lie to conceal his instigation of the Watergate burglary, and he began to cover all traces of his involvement in events prior to June 17th. So Dean calls Haldeman early on the 23rd, told him that the FBI was out of control and that Patrick Gray doesn't know what the hell to do because one check in Bernard Barker's account bore the signature of Kenneth Dahlberg, and others had come from a Mexican bank that the FBI had already found. And briefly, what was going on, as I had mentioned, there was a deadline that was coming up as a result of campaign election reform in which further contributions all had to be denote where the money was coming from. So these guys on the committee to re-elect were out there pulling lots of money in from contributors and putting them into a bank account in Florida. So they did not have to reveal who contributed to the money. Kenneth Dahlberg is a money raiser up in Minnesota. He has a famous $25,000 check. He collected money, ran it through his account, and then put it into this bank in Florida. I can't, off the top of my mind, I can't think of the lawyer in Mexico City who collected a great deal of money coming out of Texas and ran that money into the Florida bank. The money coming out of Texas were coming from Democrats who didn't want their name associated with Nixon. They wanted him elected, and they were putting money toward it, but they didn't want their name attached to it. And so this is what Nixon and Haldeman eventually are going to be trying to cover up. We told these guys that we wouldn't reveal that information, and we're going to keep our word for it. So that's why the money being run into this Florida bank account is of importance. As Dean will say, they'll know who the depositors are today, and that's what they're trying to hide. Dean continued to tell Haldeman that our problem now is to stop the FBI from opening up a whole lot of other things, especially the names of contributors who've been guaranteed anonymity. Well, having softened him up, Dean next offered Haldeman a lifeline. Dean said that the FBI is convinced that the people behind the break-in were CIA and that Gray has been looking for a way out of the mess. I spoke to Mitchell, and he and I agree the thing for us to do is for you to tell Walters, that is Deputy Director CIA Vernon Walters, that we don't know where the Mexican investigation is going to lead. Have him talk to Gray, and maybe CIA can turn off the FBI down there in Mexico. This was the idea planted in Haldeman's mind, and blames goes to John Mitchell. The chain of logic was powerful. Use CIA to block FBI so that FBI would not stumble upon and publicize the politically explosive fact that the burglary had been committed with money given to the CRP that had been laundered from influential Democratic donors. That's what they're trying to hide. So on the morning of June 23rd, Dean plants in Haldeman's mind that it was Mitchell's recommendation to use CIA to block the FBI. But Mitchell has no idea what's going on and how his name is being misused. At 10 a.m., Haldeman began to brief Nixon, and the conversation turns to Watergate. Haldeman tells Nixon the FBI investigation of the checks might lead to Dahlberg and some Texas contributors. Nixon, of course, had no idea who Dahlberg was. He essentially had no idea anything that was going on here. However, at this juncture, when his aide first suggested to him the magnitude of Watergate, that it entailed not only out-of-control employees at CRP, but money that could be traced to the campaign, Nixon's reaction was strikingly similar to the one that he displayed 6 months earlier when presented with the fact that Admiral Wellender had been spying on him. The president sought to limit the investigation and prevent political damage. So what Nixon is doing now is exactly what he did 6 months earlier when faced with a difficult situation. Let's bury it. Let's cover it up. Make it go away. As I had noted in December 71 with the Moore-Radford scandal, he had acted on his own initiative. But here now, 6 months later, June 72, he is grasping at a device presented to him by John Dean, though he didn't know that it was Dean's devising. Learning of Dahlberg and the others, Nixon's immediate response was to suggest to these people that they be instructed to say that the money be given directly to the Cubans, but Haldeman knew that wasn't going to fly, so he steered Nixon back to the CIA story. Well, Nixon likes it. He reminding Haldeman, we protected Helms from one hell of a lot of things, taking the CIA connection line of thinking and running with it. Now he's going to go with it. And the idea became settled in the president's mind. The break-in seemed to have been a CRP operation that had Mitchell's tacit approval, but had gone amok. He was happy and satisfied that it could not be laid at the feet of the person for whom he had been thinking was responsible, and that was Chuck Colson. Nixon and Haldeman returned to the CIA FBI theme here. Nixon said he wasn't sure what was being described to him at the FBI analysis, that the break-in was a CIA thing, but I'm not going to get it involved. Nixon bought Dean's package and he left it to Haldeman to wrap it up properly. Haldeman should call in the CIA and lean on the agency. However, the president could not leave the matter alone without coaching Haldeman on how to play it tough in the meeting, because that's the way they play it, and that's the way we're going to play it with the CIA. It's worth noting that Nixon never considered summoning Mitchell, Gray, or anyone else and asking them what the heck is going on, because to do so would have been confrontational, and Nixon's style was to avoid confrontation. And is he going to pay a price for that now?
Boy, yeah.
Haldeman's June 23rd meeting with the president ended at 11:39, and he immediately arranged a meeting between Walters, Helms, Ehrlichman, and himself for 1:30. This thing is moving quickly. Moments before the meeting, Haldeman poked his head into the Oval Office, and again, Nixon re-emphasized the way to get the CIA to cooperate. Tell CIA officials, Nixon instructed, it's going to make the CIA look bad. It's going to make Hunt look bad. It's going to blow the whole Bay of Pigs thing, which we think would be very unfortunate for the CIA and for the country at this time, and for American foreign policy. I don't want them to get any ideas. We're doing it because our concern is political. And I ask, was Nixon mistaken in his remark about the whole Bay of Pigs thing? No, but I don't want to go off on that tangent just yet. Dean suggested a blatant political move, and Nixon threw a national security blanket over it. At the 1:30 meeting, Helms surprised Haldeman by telling him that he'd already spoken with Gray at FBI and told him, hey, there's no CIA involvement. Well, Haldeman played Nixon's trump card, telling the CIA man that, the entire affair might be linked to Bay of Pigs. And with that, Helms came unglued. The Bay of Pigs has nothing to do with this. Eventually, Helms calmed down and voiced no further objections. Dean apparently had an idea about what was going on, because at 1:35, he called Gray and told him to expect an appointment with Walters. And Gray met with Walters at 2:34 p.m. at FBI headquarters. This thing just went boom, boom, boom. Gray would later testify that Walters informed me we were likely to uncover some CIA assets or sources if we continued our investigation into the Mexican money claim. After Walters left, Gray telephoned Dean to tell him of the meeting even before Gray telephoned his own assistant director in charge of the Watergate investigation to tell him not to schedule interviews with Dahlberg and others. Managed to get this thing shut down. Twice more during the afternoon, Gray phoned Dean to report the CIA and FBI had been properly instructed about impeding the ongoing investigation. The deed was done, and Dean had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. He had deceived the president into joining a conspiracy to obstruct justice in order to cover up a crime that Nixon had not committed and to conceal Dean's own crimes. And the president, once again, reacting to a crisis without gathering the facts, willingly slipped the noose that Dean had handed him around his own neck. 2 years from that time, the revelations of the smoking gun tape would force an end to his presidency. And as I said, we will explore that whole process in part 2 of the course right here. That concludes episode 4 here. So let me stop our share here. I know I had to get a lot in under the wire here, and thank you for going along with me. But any questions that you might have about this material?
Okay, my biggest question is Delano.
Go ahead, Delano.
In the beginning, or my second session, when I first started listening to this, I got the impression that Dean was an up-and-coming player, and he really wanted Nixon's approval. He wanted to get a favorable impression. He wanted to make a favorable impression. So now it seems that it's more just the opposite. It's him trying to remove Nixon. You're
right. He's trying to save his own ass is what's going on right here.
Yeah, I see that, but
he's not trying to get Nixon removed, but if I can get this investigation stopped, we'll all be saved. He doesn't know about the taping system that exists. The only way, I'm going to jump way ahead now. The only way Nixon is going to resign is because of the revelations on that tape.
Right.
And Dean doesn't know. Dean thinks I'm trying to save myself, and I just got to get this investigation turned off, and all this is going to go away. So Dean is saving himself. He's not trying to get the president yet.
Okay.
That's coming. That's coming in part 2.
Okay. All right.
Anyone else?
Yeah, John,
Yes.
this is Barb.
Go ahead, Barb.
What did Dean think he was going to be able to do with that information about the call girls? I mean, it doesn't sound like he was trying to shut down that operation. And what benefit to him was it having that information that his girlfriend was a call girl? He already knew that.
I think what it is that his relationship with Maureen Biner is changing. You know, for one thing, he's a player himself. He's going out and he'd been dating a lot of girls. And he suddenly gets captivated by Maureen Biner. She's like a class above him. And he wants her very much, but he finds out she's working in this operation. So maybe she tells him, and this is my speculation, listen, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm not involved, but he doesn't trust her. So he wants to find out, because he's learned through the arrest of Philip Megan Bailey and taking a look at his address books, that her name is in that address book. And I think that, and this is my speculation, that Dean, as a jealous boyfriend, wants to ensure that she is not in that collection of photographs over there in Maxie Wells's file cabinet. And he's got to send this team in to photograph everything to ensure that. That's all. He's just a jealous boyfriend who doesn't trust her. And maybe she's telling him, I'm not here, but he's got to prove it to himself. That's my speculation on it, Barb.
Now, was Dee married at the time?
No, he's not. They're living. I think they're starting to live together. And once this Watergate situation gets out of control, they will quickly marry. And Dean, I think, is marrying her quickly so that she, as a spouse, cannot testify against him. Now, one thing that Dean is going to do is that he is going to he's going to say, I'm just borrowing money from a slush fund that is accessible to him. And unfortunately, for their honeymoon, for their wedding and honeymoon, unfortunately, he never is going to pay it back. So one of the big crimes against Dean that we'll look at in part 2 is, he's going to rip off about $5,000 from the political contributions here. But he's going to say, I'm going to pay it back, but it never gets paid back. There's more coming up here.
Sheesh.
Anybody else? Hey, Margaret, come on. What's going on? Those bears are outside. Put your off. Come off mute, baby.
I guess I'm just thinking about how we think nowadays our government is in a mess, but it looks like it's always been that way. The more things change, the more they stay the same. I'm amazed at the fact that, maybe Nixon was too naive. You never think of him that way, but it seems like he was.
Which is why I went into detail to talk about the events as they led up to that crucial meeting of June 23rd. It'll help us appreciate what happens afterwards right there.
Yeah.
Anyone else want, I have to be mindful of our time right here. Anyone else want to ask a question or make a comment at this time before we bring this part of our story to a close?
John, I have one question for you.
Go ahead.
The break-in at the Watergate with the Board of Governors, do you know what that was about?
No, I don't.
It was about the wage and price controls of Nixon. He was imposing that.
Oh, right.
But the question I have, because again, why did they, the Board of Governors didn't have the capacity to do that.
Yeah.
So what they did is they contracted it out to a private firm, and they have offices in Watergate. Why did that get broken into?
Oh, boy,
so
what a fascinating question.
Yeah, that just now it's just I'm going to go down a rabbit hole now after this because I'm thinking about
my work here
not during this. We're not here. I mean, after we end this call, because I'm going to find out. I'm going to make a few phone calls. I just don't understand that because it doesn't make sense why that would happen.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Anyway, that's all.
Yeah. Penny, anything from you before we close out here?
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you thank you very much. I'm looking forward to part 2, and you have really done your research, and this is very interesting, very fascinating. So thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. But but the credit really goes to the authors on your source book. I'm really just carrying their message forward here. So if you chance, down the road here, if this is intrigued you, find those books and read in depth about what they talk about.
I did. I bought Silent Coup. It came yesterday. So
oh, beautiful, baby. Good girl, Penny. All right. Well, everyone, thank you. This has been a wonderful journey. As I've said, this particular course I'm having more fun with this course than I probably deserve.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.